Welcome to Seize the Mains by Raj Malhotra IS Academy. I am Surbhi Sardana and I will be taking this daily answer writing initiative from Monday to Friday at 9 pm. Today is day 6 of our discussion and the topic for today is from GS2, Separation of Powers between Various Organs, Dispute Redressal Mechanisms and Institutions. So about this topic, separation of powers between various organs, that is executive, legislative and judiciary. You can expect a separate question for two of the organs. You can be asked to compare and contrast between the separation of powers between executive and judiciary, legislative and judiciary, or executive and legislature. So this is the area which is most favorite of UPSC examiners. They tend to ask questions from this area every other year. So it's better that you prepare well in advance that what are the provisions of constitution or how does our polity function in a way where there is not explicit separation of powers happening, rather there is a fusion of powers. So prepare this topic well in advance so that you can take questions from this part of the syllabus very easily. So before displaying the question for the day, again, I recommend that you keep a pen and a pencil, a pen and a paper with you, and you write down the points that come to your mind and use them in your answer. Also, as in when I'm talking, there are many things which are not written in the presentation. So just note down the points that appeal to you and use them in your answers and understand the strategy on how to build the structure of an answer. So let's begin by displaying the question for today. The question is, the functional overlap seen in executive, legislative and judiciary dilutes the principle of separation of powers. Comment and answer in 250 words. Now this is a very straightforward question. This is a very basic question which has been taken from this part of the syllabus. There are no twists and turns involved. There is no current affairs related dialogue involved here. You just have to answer why there is a functional overlap. The functional overlap has been seen, how there is a functional overlap between the functioning of three organs of the government, and comment what are your views regarding this, and is it diluting the principle of separation of powers, this functional overlap. So you just have to comment, you just have to narrate what you think about the present situation or the statement given in the question. So let's see. Let's start by underlining the keywords for this question. The first one is functional overlap. All the three organs of the government perform some functions. Since there is a functional overlap, we'll discuss about that. Seen in executive, legislative, the three organs of the government dilutes the principle of separation of powers. So this is a very strong statement here. Dilutes or undermines the doctrine of separation of powers in the working of Indian polity. So this has to be addressed. Let's see how we'll build our answer. As usual, we'll start by writing an introduction. In introduction, we'll talk about what's being written in the question. We'll paraphrase it and we'll add our knowledge, whatever we know from our part of knowledge, we'll add that into the introduction so that it appears to the examiner that we know and we have studied polity. The recommendation for polity answers from my side would be that you study your regular books, whatever you're studying for prelims or mains, study your regular polity books, and apart from that, go through the chapters of NCERTs. In NCERTs, polity NCERTs, you might not find very much information relevant for prelims, but for mains you can find out very good introductions and conclusions. And in fact, there are some concepts like secularism which have not been explained anywhere else, and questions from these topics are asked regularly. And if you have studied from those NCERTs for your mains, you'll be very well able to answer these questions and grab very high marks in mains for these questions. So let's start by answering this question first and then we'll discuss about polity more in detail. So first of all, talking about separation of powers. See, separation of powers is a doctrine which ensures that there is clear-cut division of powers between three organs. No organ of the government overlaps its functioning with the other two. everybody has its own boundary, and within that they act accordingly. They have their own powers and nobody interferes in anyone else's work. So if we see in the case of United States of America, there is clear-cut separation of powers, and in most presidential systems, separation of powers is a very well established doctrine. But in parliamentary forms of government, like in UK and especially in India, we're talking about India. So in parliamentary forms of government, it is very hard to establish separation of powers, clear-cut separation of powers. Why? Because the people elect the legislature. Out of the legislature, the executive is selected, the executive is nominated. So executive and legislature are already overlapping. The people are the same working there. So separation of powers is undermined, it's diluted. And in our parliamentary system, we have many judicial powers with the legislature and executive, and even the judiciary also legislates sometimes. So this could be an overlapping, this could be a chaotic situation at times, and it has been seen in the past many a times. But this is also for the welfare of people. This also ensures checks and balances in the working of the country. This also ensures rule of law. So this is separation of powers with exceptions has been adopted for the working of Indian polity, and that's what you have to write about in your answer. That okay, we do not have separation of powers as much as there is in the United States of America, and also we have a parliamentary form of government. So separation of powers is not apparent also to a certain extent, but we do have clear-cut division of powers, and whatever exceptions are there in the working of our polity, they are only for the welfare of people, and they are just there to suit the diversity and the working of Indian polity, so that the things become easier and efficient with time. It's not something that if we are not following this basic doctrine, then we are doing something wrong. You don't have to write that in your answer, you don't have to give a negative answer, you just have to, especially in your introduction, tell whatever you know about it, tell what are the exceptions that are there in the Indian political system, and while going towards the conclusion, just make sure that the examiner knows that you understand why such exceptions are there, and give a positive and forward-looking conclusion. So starting with the introduction, let's read out. First of all, we will be defining separation of powers. What does separation of power mean here? So let's start by defining it. Separation of powers refers to the model of governance where the executive, legislative and judicial powers are not concentrated in one body, but instead divided into different branches. This is the basic definition of separation of powers. We've started by talking about it, and this is very simple. The doctrine of separation of powers, this is very important. The doctrine of separation of powers is part of basic structure of the Constitution. Here, two cases are mentioned in which it was explicitly stated by the Supreme Court that separation of powers is a part of basic structure of Constitution. You can add more cases if they come to your mind from your side, but talking about the basic structure, these two were the cases in which Supreme Court iterated. The first is Keshav Nanda Bharti case, and the second is I.R. Coelho case. I.R. Coelho case 2007 is also known as Schedule 9 judgment. Prepare this very much in detail, Schedule 9 of the Constitution and I.R. Coelho case. Questions have been asked in the past few years for prelims at least twice or thrice from this particular area, I.R. Coelho and 9th Schedule of Constitution. So, basic structure of Constitution. Separation of powers is part of basic structure, and we have mentioned two cases here. So this makes your polity answers look good. This is enriched with knowledge that okay, by mentioning cases, by mentioning judgments, or by mentioning constitutional articles. So this gets you more marks in your polity answers. And after talking about the basic structure in cases, we just put it in a line that since it is part of the basic structure, this cannot be amended. Separation of powers cannot be diluted by even the constitutional amendments under Article 368. The Parliament, the legislature cannot dilute it, cannot do away with it, because it's part of the basic structure of the Constitution. So this is your This part is your introduction. It very well defines what is asked in the question, what is being talked about in the question. It gives a nice polity based introduction by talking about various judgments and the implications of something being the basic structure, being in the basic structure of constitution. So talking about separation of powers, just for your understanding, separation of powers has not been explicitly mentioned in the constitution. You will not find any article in the constitution which says that okay, this article so and so gives India separation of powers or defines for itself separation of powers between different organs of the government. There is no article like that. But there are many other articles in DPSPs, Directive Principles of State Policy, and more articles which define powers of executive, legislative and judiciary, through which we understand that yes, one organ of the government cannot intervene in the working area of the other organ of the government or judiciary. So from those articles we interpret that yes, there is separation of powers in the constitution and we cannot do away with it. So what are the articles? Here it is. Although this doctrine doesn't find an explicit mention in the constitution, but various constitutional provisions ensure separation of powers. They are Article 50, okay, we'll be talking about them in detail. So talking about the structure of the answer once again, start by defining, start by explaining, start by a little show off of your knowledge of articles and judgments, and then come to the technical part, that what is separation, what is the status of separation of powers in India. So coming to the technical part, we've said that it's not there in the constitution, it's not explicitly written in the constitution, but the constitution very well means it and defines. It doesn't define it, but we understand it from the constitution. So these are the articles: Article 50, Article 121 and 211, Article 122 and 212, Article 361. Article 50 is well known to all of us because it's part of the Directive Principles of State Policy. It states that the state shall take steps to separate the judiciary from the executive. So any executive body will not be allowed to perform judicial functions. So that's what it states. This article is very important and it has to be mentioned in your answers of separation of powers. Even if you get a question which talks about overlapping of powers between executive and judiciary, make sure that you mention this article. The next part is about judiciary. These two articles, Article 121 and 211, simple to learn. So they talk about that whatever are the judicial proceedings, how they are conducted and how the conduct of judicial proceedings cannot be discussed in any of the legislatures. It cannot be discussed in parliament or any of the state legislatures. So judges, the judiciary has its authority to conduct its judicial proceedings in the way it likes because it's a separate organ of the government. The parliament or any state legislative body doesn't have the power to discuss about it, to comment on it. Okay, so the next point, here we talk about judiciary, judicial independence. The next is Article 122 and 212. Earlier we talked about judicial proceedings, now we will talk about the legislative proceedings. Validity of proceedings in parliaments and state legislatures cannot be called into question in any court. So if when you listen to debates of Rajya Sabha or Lok Sabha so many times, there are so many things that happen. People say so many things to each other which can be called into question in the court if it had been a normal discussion. But since we have these articles, Article 122 and 212 in place, so whatever happens inside the parliament or state legislatures cannot be called into question in any court. So the parliament regulates the conduct. Of course, there are many committees which regulate the conduct, and they have judicial powers also, those committees, to regulate the conduct of the members of parliament or MLAs. But you cannot just go to the Supreme Court and say that okay, this person misbehaved or this person did this or said that, or any of the ways in which parliamentary proceedings or proceedings in any of the state legislatures are conducted, they cannot be called into question in any of the courts. So here we have talked about judicial independence, here about legislative independence. The next articles talk about the executive independence. So the executive, governor and the president form part of the executive. The other people, the council of ministers or cabinet ministers, whosoever, they are also part of the legislature. But here talking about the president and governor, they are explicitly part of the executive. So they'll not be answerable to any court for the exercise and performance of their duties of office. So whatever they do, they'll not be individually liable to the judiciary or to the legislature. They cannot be called into question for anything that they do for serving the office out of the powers that have been given to them by the office of president or governor. So here we have talked about six articles, 3 points through which we have elaborated that how separation of powers is envisaged in the constitution. The word separation of powers is not directly used, but it has been given in the constitution. So these 4 points are very important. Just look into the word limit of your question. If it is asking you to write 250 words, then you can give 1 line of definition for all these articles. Or if, for example, if the word limit is just 150 words, so just write down these articles and give like 2 lines for all of them combined, that these are the articles which ensure the independent working of executive, legislature and judiciary, and you can give a definition for article 50 separately in a separate line. So make sure that you write well in the given word limit. So this was about our introduction. Now let's see how can we start to build our body paragraphs. For that, how can we introduce our body paragraphs? For that, we'll go on to the linkage point for this answer. Okay, so as I mentioned before starting this answer, that we in India have a parliamentary form of government. So there is obviously an overlap between the people also who are appointed to council of ministers. They are a part of legislature. So how can you ensure a complete division of powers? That's not possible, but it's there for the welfare of our nation, welfare of the people. So talking about the linkage point here, the parliamentary system of government in India is based on the principle of cooperation and coordination between the various organs of government. So the 3 organs of the government do not work in isolation as in the case of USA or any other country for that matter. In India, all the 3 organs, yes, there is a division of powers between amongst all of them, but they all work in coordination and cooperation. Okay, so hence naturally there is some overlapping of functions between various organs as described below. So now we'll be talking about where do the functions of these 3 organs overlap, which is the demand of the question. They have asked you to comment on it. So we'll just write about what we know about the answer and generate a viewpoint on that. Talking firstly about the executive, then we'll go to the legislature and judiciary. Here we'll be talking about the powers of executive or the roles of executive, which are not just executive powers or executive roles, they can be judicial or legislative roles. So we'll see that where is the executive power overlapping with judicial or legislative powers. So let's start by talking about the articles mentioned in the constitution. Okay, the first point here talks about the legislative power of the executive. Now making laws, passing acts, passing bills, making laws is a legislative function. It's function of the legislature of the country or of the state. So parliament and state legislatures have that power to pass acts, but in certain cases when the houses are not in session or when a bill cannot be passed and it's required, it's very urgent, then we resort to the resort to ordinance making power of the president. So ordinance is basically a law which is passed for some time, which is active for some time. You must have read about it. There are different provisions related to it, but this is a legislative power that has been enforced in the executive. The president is the executive here, and ordinance making power is a legislative power that's been given to the president in times of emergency or when there is a need of passing an act. Okay, so next here we talk about judicial powers of the president. Now of the executive, the judicial powers of the executive. President has got pardoning powers. It can give reprieve, respite, or it can commute a death sentence or any other sentence passed by Supreme Court or High Court. So it has got pardoning powers under Article 72 of the Constitution. Also, it has the power of consulting Supreme Court of India. And thirdly, the appointment of judges of Supreme Courts and High Courts and the Chief Justice of India, they are done by the President itself. President is an executive authority, but he appoints the judges to Supreme Court and High Courts. So these are the areas where the executive organ of the government has judicial and legislative powers. So this is an overlapping area. Now we'll talk about what powers of the legislative organ of the government overlap with judicial and executive powers. So the first thing that comes to our mind is that we select our executive members for the functioning of the country from the legislative members itself. So the people are also the same. So overlapping powers will be there for sure. The Council of Ministers is selected from the legislature, and the council is responsible to the legislature. So selected from there, going upwards and responsible to the legislature itself. So this is your first overlapping. So the Council of Ministers advise the president, and in case of a state legislature, whatever the council is there, they advise the governor, and president and governor, they act on the recommendations of their respective councils. And they are also parts of the legislature. So this is an overlapping function because the legislature in a way is advising the functioning of the executive. And here the last 2 points talk about the judicial powers of the legislature. So there is impeachment of president, there is removal of judges that happens. This is totally a legislative process, but this is the way in which the legislatures affect the working of judiciary and executive, because whatever elections are there or whatever the removal is there, they have to be conducted by the legislative authority only. So that overlapping is there. There is not a total separation of powers. Judiciary is appointing its judges itself, but the removal of judges of any Supreme Court or High Court have to be done by a legislative process. So there is an overlapping of functions. There is no independent functioning of these three organs. And also the impeachment of president, as we talked about. President is an executive person, executive body. The office of president is an executive body, and its removal, its impeachment is done by the legislature. Next, talking about the judicial functions, the organ of judiciary and its powers which are overlapping with the executive and legislature. So we have this very fundamental article, the Article 142 of the Constitution. According to this article, the Supreme Court has the power to do anything it likes. It has executive powers to ensure complete justice in the nation. So when this article is in place, when Supreme Court is using its powers from Article 142, it acts as an executive body. Also, according to these articles, by using Articles 142 and 145, Supreme Court of India can strike down any act passed by the legislature, and it can strike down these acts based on the fact that they do not adhere to the principles of Constitution. So you must have heard about NJAC, National Judicial Appointment Council. This was an act, this was a constitutional amendment passed by the parliament, passed by the legislature of the country, but this was struck down by the Supreme Court as it was against the separation of powers according to the Supreme Court of India. So NJAC could not come into functioning. So this is your Article 142 and 145. It gives the Supreme Court of India some executive powers, and these are very powerful articles. Prepare them in detail. As we talked about NJAC, constitutional amendments can be struck down by Supreme Court if they violate the basic structure of the Constitution, if they don't adhere to the basic principles mentioned in the Constitution. So these are the powers of Supreme Court where they overlap with the executive and legislative functioning of those organs of the government. In many cases, it has been seen that Supreme Court issues directions to various state governments or central governments to make a certain type of law. For example, laws ensuring equal rights for the LGBTQ community, or laws ensuring equal rights to any kind of community. talking about this part, that Supreme Court does from time to time issue directions to the legislature or executive to bring in certain laws which are important for the functioning of society. Just go to the Google News column, type separation of powers there, and before your exams, whatever are the recent happenings there, like for example, just a few days back, the High Court, the Supreme Court directed the Tamil Nadu state government to create a certain type of law. So whatever appears on the Google News column related to separation of powers, use that as an example in this point here, if there is enough word limit available for you. So now we have discussed about what separation of powers is. We have given a very good introduction. We have talked about the articles which tell us about the separation of powers in the constitution. We have talked about what overlapping of powers we have in India in all the three organs of the government. You have to talk about all the three organs separately, or if it is a 150 words answer, just write down the keywords, whatever keywords you can find in these points, just write down them and make sure that you see in a 150 words answer, you don't have to cut down on points or the content you are writing. You just have to don't use full sentences. Either use a diagram or a structural flow chart to make sure that the examiner gets to know that you know every part of the question, or just write down the keywords as point number 1 to 7 and ensure that you are writing in points in a 150 words answer, because paragraphs are not much appealing to the examiner many a times. Don't cut down on knowledge, just change the way, just tweak the way you are presenting your answer. So here we talked about all the separate organs in detail. Now we'll move towards our conclusion. In conclusion, we just have to mention that yes, there is an overlapping of powers happening in India, in Indian political system, but that does not mean that it is something very wrong. When it is talked about, taking a certain example, for example, when we talked about NJAC, that was the time when separation of powers was very much in news. But when you get a general question and a certain issue has not been asked in the question, then you have to give a general forward-looking introduction that whatever is happening is right. Yes, there is sometimes an overreach of powers. We talk about judicial overreach so many times, that judiciary is going out of its judicial boundaries and getting into the sphere of executive and legislative organs. But that has to be just one line. You have to give a positive introduction. You cannot, a positive conclusion. You just cannot talk about negatively about any organs of the government. So when you start to conclude, just agree to whatever has been given in the question and say that yes, this is for the welfare of our nation. So now we'll talk about this person. He was Montesquieu. He was a French philosopher, French political and social philosopher, and he gave the idea of separation of powers. He said that liberty in any country cannot be ensured unless there are separate organs of the government operating executive, legislative and judicial functions. If power is not divided between these three organs, then liberty cannot be ensured in the functioning of any government. So here we are talking about a thinker, and make sure that you talk about him or any other thinker when you are writing about such a basic concept like separation of powers in your polity answers. So yes, according to Montesquieu, separation of powers is essential. Why is it essential? We've seen here. And then agree to the fact that yes, the functional overlapping as seen above is there. There is some functional overlapping in the functioning of our polity, but it ensures, what are its benefits? It is there to ensure checks and balances. It is there to ensure rule of law. It is there to check arbitrariness and ensures cooperation. All the organs of the government act in cooperation with each other. There is a decentralization of decision making that's happening. All the organs keep check on the other government, on the other organs. So no organ of the government gets to overreach its boundaries to a very large extent. It prevents tyranny of those in power. It prevents that. So this is how you give a forward-looking conclusion to your answer. If you have some words left, then these 4 points, checks and balances, rule of law, check in arbitrariness and cooperation. Elaborate these while writing your conclusion if you have some word limit left. or if you don't have word limit left, if it's just a 150 words answer, just write them down and underline these points. Okay, so now we conclude by saying that for a diverse and democratic country like India, for such a large country like India, a strict separation of powers is very much impractical. Rather, what we aim for is coordination between all organs of the government, so we can give maximum benefit to the people. Welfare of people can be promoted. So that's how you will conclude here by giving a statement, giving few statements that are unique to India, that make India unique, the diversity, the democracy, the parliamentary system. So that's how you conclude your answer. Okay, just go through this one and I'll read out for you. Judicious and calculated constitutional functional overlapping has made way for democratic collaboration of the three organs of the government. So what we are seeing is a democratic collaboration. It's not tyranny of any organ of the government is not happening. What we have in India is democratic collaboration. So this is a nice way to say that we have separation of powers, but with certain exceptions. So democratic collaboration is the word you should be using in your answer. Such mutual cooperation bridges the executive, legislative and judicial gap, facilitating smooth functioning of government. So notice the word gap here. No organ of the government is acting in isolation. If the judiciary instructs the parliament to enact a certain kind of law, then it is for the welfare of people. It ensures that there are no gaps in the functioning of three organs of the government, and whatever the time demands, whatever laws are demanded, whatever disciplinary actions are demanded by time, they are put in place with effective coordination between all the three organs. So I think this is a very well framed answer. Go through it, download the PDF file for this presentation, read the whole answer and try to frame your own answer. See, there are many points that we have written about in subsections of executive, legislative and judiciary. If you are writing your answer and if you are sending them to us, just don't copy what's being written here. Go through Google News column or go through your own textbooks or your coaching notes or your personal or whatever the sources that you're following. Refer to NCERTs on the same issues. Go through the index of NCERTs, that what all you can incorporate, what are the examples that you can add in, almost like add like 2-3 examples from your side also in your answer and then send them to us. Okay, so this is the answer for the day. Tomorrow we'll be meeting with another question that will be from GS3 environment. It is about conservation, environment pollution and degradation, and environmental impact assessment. Environmental impact assessment has been in news for the past 2 years, so we'll try to focus on that area. Send your answers by 12 PM tomorrow, that is Feb 16. And we are already working on the answers that you've already sent us. Don't worry, we have not missed out on any of your responses. We'll be responding back in time with our valuable feedback. And going back to the first introductory video, as I said, that whenever you have been into answer writing for 15 days, just start going back to the answers you have written on the first day and start self-evaluating them, that what all can you incorporate from those answers. And if there are any issues, you can go through the videos or these PDFs once again. Mail your answers to us at rmieswriting@gmail.com, and you can download the schedule for till March 17. This program, this initiative will definitely run for 90 days at least. We'll stop only for prelims break. Around May 5, we'll stop for 1 month for prelims break. And apart from that, we'll be covering all the parts of your GS mains for UPSC, and I think state civil services people can also benefit out of this. Now talking about something that has come from your side, many of the students have been demanding essay writing practice, lectures on essay writing what we have decided is that this program will go on for a certain time. This will go as it is there, and in some, like after a few days or weeks, we'll plan out on a structure of essay writing and we'll come out with a series on that, maybe a weekly series, one video lecture or something like that. So don't worry, stay tuned with us, keep working hard, and all the best.